on their journey. All right, so we're going to be looking at the principles, the spiritual principles for each step, and we'll go through it as follows. So we'll move on to the first step. So first spiritual principle of step 1 is honesty. This is what is required for your loved one to start partaking on this journey. That is the requirement for this step. So step 1 reads, we admitted we were powerless over substances and that our lives had become unmanageable. So what we do in the treatment center with your loved ones when it comes to step 1 is we break it down into 2 compartments. So the first part is powerlessness, and obviously the second part is unmanageability. So we get your loved ones to look at how substance abuse has impacted them negatively, of course. How they've got themselves into dangerous situations, either being in an accident, either putting other people's lives in danger. So what we do with them in treatment is we get them to start writing those events, and also look at the consequences, how it has impacted them and how it has impacted their families as well, or their loved ones. And then what we also look at when it comes to powerlessness is the self-destructive behavior, reckless behavior, not following with commitments, always saying I'll do this but never following up. That's the powerlessness that comes with step 1. So we get them to have a look at it, pen and paper, put it all down and have a good look at what their lives have become. And then we also look at loss of control. We also look at the preoccupation that is induced by substance abuse. Then when we look at the unmanageability part of it, is how it has impacted their health, health conditions. What diagnosis do they have as a direct result of them abusing substances? We also look at their family lives, either going through a divorce. We also look at neglection of people, family members, kids, if they do have. We also look at the lack of respect that they might have shown to their family or loved ones as a direct result of substance abuse. Then what we also look at as unmanageability is their work life, their study life, or their businesses, how they've lost their jobs, or how they are on the verge of losing their jobs as a result of substances. We also look at their social life. Are they isolating from friends? Do they have family members that don't want to be around them anymore? This is as a result of the powerlessness and the unmanageability. And what we also look at in treatment is the internal unmanageability. The loneliness, the feelings of uselessness, the self-loathing, no self-love. All these things come up as a result of abusing substances. So that is step 1. Step 1 has to be taken quite firmly because it's a foundation, and it requires a lot of honesty. So that is step 1, and that's what we focus on in inpatient. And I know a lot of family members last week heard the program being mentioned. So the 12 steps we use as a form of a program. This program has been around for about 85 years. Over 200 million people have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. So, it works. A lot of people are living through this program. So once they leave the facility or inpatient, and this is why we usually encourage secondary facility, because when they move on to their secondary phase, that's when they start moving on to step 2. Okay, can we quickly look at step 2 and what it requires? All right, so the spiritual principle of step 2 is hope. So on this phase, we say we came to believe in a power that's greater than ourselves. So what we try to teach, your loved ones is that they were living a life where they solely relied on their own power. They did not have a power greater than themselves. They were running on self-will. So therefore, that's why that word is they came to believe. It's a process. When they do arrive, some are agnostics. Some don't believe that there's a God. Some do believe that there's a God. However, they're running a not so God-centered life. So therefore, we get them to the point where they realize how they have been insane in the actions that they've done. Keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And that's why step 2 states that we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And for that we require the hope. We have to be hopeful. And then, Kate, let's look at step 3. Okay, so when your loved ones moved on to this phase or this step, it says they made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. So the key fundamental, words there would be made a decision. A lot of the patients that we see, they believe that step 3 is just a written step and you forget about it, you put it in the back burner. What happens with this step is a decision that has to be made on a daily basis, to turn our will, which is our thoughts, and our actions, which is our lives. We believe that every action is born from thought. So therefore, once we turn our will and our lives, which is our thought and our actions, over to the care of God, as we understand Him, our lives start getting better. So we encourage our patients or your loved ones to act themselves into a new way of thinking instead of thinking themselves into a new way of life. And that's the process there. And then also another word there that could be shocking for some people and some patients as well is the word God, because like I said, in step 2, most of them come in and they have no understanding or concept of God. They have ideas of other people's gods. So at this phase, we teach and encourage them to create their own God as they understand them. God, we break it down to good orderly direction. So it doesn't have to be somebody else's God. It's the patients start writing up the characteristics that their own God could have. Either that would be loving, caring, forgiving, non-judgmental. It's whatever they understand that God's concept to be. And most of the times we see patients looking at the fellowship as good orderly direction. So like I said, this is the step that gets taken on a daily basis. Upon awakening, we encourage your loved ones to make that decision, to not run on self-will and say, God, take it, or good orderly direction, direct me throughout my day, and they seek for guidance. Okay, so now we're going to move on to step 4. Okay, so the principle of step 4 is truth. Okay, so as step 4 reads that we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. So when your loved ones get to this stage, they have to be honest with themselves and make this searching and fearless moral inventory. And what this consists of is 4 parts. So it consists of resentment, it consists of fears, it consists of sexual misconduct, as well as harmed. So they need to truthfully look at how they've been harboring resentments. So the next question when it comes to resentments would be why? Why was I angry? And what parts of selves were injured? So that would either be self-esteem was injured, or pride was injured, or pocketbook was injured. Then the next block that they look at truthfully is what they did to contribute to it. How were they to blame? And often, when we see people go on to step 4, is a list of all these people that they feel they've harmed them, and then they get to realize that, oh wait, I actually played a part in it. So this step teaches people to take accountability. It teaches loved ones or patients to take accountability for their actions and truthfully look at what they or how they've contributed to it. So that is the resentments. How we usually explain resentments is like drinking poison and expecting somebody else to die. Then we look at the second part of it, like I said, which is fears. How most patients are riddled with 1,000 forms of fears. If one is living on fear, it automatically takes out the hope and the faith. because those two can't live together. And that's what we teach your loved ones when it comes to this step. Also looking at harms, how have I harmed others? And truthfully, how have I harmed others? How has my addiction affected or impacted other people around me? And that's therefore it does get quite daunting for most patients, but once they get into it, they realize how relieving it is, to finally be rid of all the baggage that they usually carry, and realizing that they had a part to play in all of it. Okay, now we're going to move on to step 5. Okay, so the spiritual principle of step 5 is integrity. Okay, so step 5 reads, we admitted to God, to ourselves, and another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. So when your loved ones get to the step, we encourage them to get a sponsor. A sponsor then on that step would be others, so another human being. That's the sponsor being somebody who has gone through the 12 steps themselves, and they get to admit to God as they understand that God aspect, and be honest and truthful about the harms that they've caused or the exact nature of their wrongs, and having to disclose that to somebody else. More often than not, what we've seen in the different fellowships is that the sponsor has usually gone through worse and overcome it. So it's not much of a shock when they hear that, oh, okay, so these are the things that you have done, which could have potentially harmed other people. And I think it's quite a step for most patients or loved ones, because it's that realization that I'm not alone. It's that realization that somebody else has gone through this, so I'll be okay. And understanding that they might have done wrong things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong, they're bad people. Okay, so that's step 5. Okay, can we move on to step 6? Okay, so step 6, the principle or spiritual principle for step 6, that will be change of heart. Okay, so it reads, we're entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character. So what happens on this step is, your loved ones would then have to look at their defects of character, which is either being selfish, self-centeredness, inconsiderate, dishonest, how they've been dishonest to themselves and to their families and loved ones, how they've been self-centered, and that forms part of their disease, how they've acted selfishly, and how they're running on fear. And there's a lot more defects. I mean, most patients come up with about 200 of those defects of character. And usually, what we teach, or try show patients or loved ones is that these are the things that usually block that connection to that higher power. So it's all the calamity, too often, especially in my experience, I find clients or patients saying, I'm struggling to connect to that power. And it's because they're riddled with selfishness, self-centeredness. It's the calamity that blocks them from the sunlight of the spirit, that makes it a bit challenging for them to connect to that higher power. So this is a crucial step, because you get to, patients get to identify their defects, these things that they're running on self-will, running on self-centeredness. It's all these things that on the next step we're going to talk about as we get to remove. Can we move on to step 7? Okay, so the principle for step 7 is humility. And it's mainly because you have to humbly ask God to remove the shortcomings. When patients get to the step, it's a humbling phase, because taking into consideration that they're moving from a phase in their lives where they were running on their own will, they didn't care about anybody and anything, and never asked for help, and they get to the step where they have to humble themselves and ask for these defects of character to be removed. So it's also quite a humbling step, which is step 7. Can we move on to step 8? Okay, so principle for step 8 is brotherly love. All right. So step 8 reads, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. So this list goes back to the list that they would have written when they were in step 4, the harms list, and preparing themselves to make amends to those people that they've harmed. And sometimes, or often, what I find in my experience is by the time the client or a patient gets to the step, they've added a few people onto that list as well. So it's quite an interesting one, because it's having, again, to be honest and writing these people's names down and preparing oneself, and to become willing to go and make amends. And that will take us to step 9. So the principle for step 9 would be restoration and reconciliation. Too often, in my experience, what I've seen is when patients or loved ones leave the treatment facility, is I need to get back home because I need to right my wrongs, and forgetting that that's only step 9. There's all the other steps and the principles that they have to live by before they actually get to that stage where they make a direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. And what we encourage patients or loved ones at this stage is to not go and say, I'm sorry, because alcoholics and addicts, sorry has been in their vocab for the longest time. So at this stage, we say, you go and you make your amends and you say, I was wrong. And that is taking responsibilities of the actions that took place. We say that the best apology is changed behavior. So between the time that they leave treatments and the time when they get to step 9 and they get to do their amends, the behavior should have changed and the principle should have been applied. Each principle should have been applied by then. Okay. Now can we move on to step 10? Okay. So the spiritual principle of step 10 is accountability. Okay. So step 10 reads, continue to take personal inventory. And when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. So what usually happens on the step is it's the personal inventory is taken on a daily basis, preferably at night. So at night, I get to look at my day and say, where was I resentful? How can I be better tomorrow than I was today? Do I owe anyone an amends? Do I need to say I was wrong to anybody today? Did I offend anybody? So it gives clients a perfect way to reflect on how they're behaving and stay aware of their behavior and try to see how they can change that the next day. And that's, of course, that's why the spiritual principle is taking accountability. Have to take accountability for how I'm acting throughout the day and how I've impacted other people as well. So the nice thing about that is just it brings that awareness and it gets the clients to take accountability for it. Then we move over to step 11. Okay, spiritual principle for step 11 is perseverance. So when they come to step 11, they have to sort through prayer and meditation to improve their conscious contact with God as they understand Him, praying only for knowledge of His will and the power to carry that out. So, the suggestion when it comes to step 11 is upon awakening or on awakening, we take a look at the day before it even starts and ask for direction and guidance. This is also a step that I usually encourage my clients to take on a daily basis because it brings that connection to that higher power. And it's saying, I don't know how to do this. A power knows, direct me. So that is, and that obviously, encourages clients or patients to stay connected to this power and not get to run on their own will and believe that they have the power and they can run their day, because we know what happens when they run their days. They'll end up in treatment. Okay, now we're going to look at step 12. Okay, so step 12 principle, spiritual principles, there's service and spirituality. You know what I like about this program as well is that it's not a religious program, it's a spiritual program. And therefore, that's why all these spiritual principles. So step 12 says, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to addicts and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So what that step is saying is that I'm not just a great person when I'm at home, or I'm not just a great person when I'm at a meeting. It means the way that I am at a meeting, when I get home, I'm the same person. So, and that's how you get to practice these principles in all your affairs, is going to work, for instance. I'm still the same person. So a lot of the times what we witness is if one is not practicing the 12-step program, they it's impossible for them to practice these spiritual principles in all their affairs. So, you know, we encourage clients or members to take up service, start carrying the message to other recovering addicts or alcoholics, help another who was just in the same position, that also need that hope, also need somebody that will say, I've been through this, I can show you the way. So that's just the joy of step 12, is, you know, having to see the light that comes on in other newcomers' face, for them to get that hope that there is hope. You know, I can get better. It does get better as time goes on, but we encourage our clients to practice all these principles in all their affairs in order for that spiritual awakening to be experienced. And the spiritual awakening is like a moral psychic change. So everything about who I was has to change. I have to be a completely different person, riddled with all these principles in order for me to be working a program. So that's just an overview of what your loved ones would have to endure when they start, you know, partaking on the 12-step program. And I do believe, Kate, we have a little video that we're going to play. Thanks, Kate.
Talk to you a bit about the 12 steps and the model for handling addiction that I've written about myself in my book Recovery, because I want to see what you think of it. The 12 steps have anonymous fellowships, which if I were to belong to them, I wouldn't be able to say I belong to them without breaching their code of anonymity. But what's positive about this approach to addiction is, as we've discussed off mic, that it creates community, like the other people that have got a similar endeavour. And in fact, it was Jung that identified this solution. He said that like people that have got chronic addiction issues will struggle to change unless they have a spiritual realization of some kind and the support of a community.
Yeah. Well, and the spiritual realization component, that's actually supported by the relevant addiction literature. One of the classic cures for addiction is spiritual transformation. And the hardcore scientists have laid that out as a reality in the addiction literature.
I agree, because to use more secular language around that, a spiritual transformation could just be a change of perspective, a renewal.
Yes, a radical change of perspective.
Yeah. And typically in my experience, that's from a self-centered view, a self-obsessive view about getting your own needs met, a solipsistic, narcissistic perspective of life is just an adventure where I go around trying to accumulate and accrue, to, oh wow, I'm here to be of service. That's sort of the transition in microscopically. But in addition to community, like having connections between one another, the 12 steps themselves, I think, are an interesting model for transformation and shouldn't be overlooked. And in fact, what my book was about is, could that method be transposed to anybody who's interested in change? So I wanted to talk to you about that to get your perspective on them. The first step is acknowledging that you are powerless over your addiction and that your life has become unmanageable. Just admitting I don't want to be in this situation.
So there's two parts to that admission. One is that you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And I guess there's three. You're in trouble and it's serious. Things could be better, and you don't have the wherewithal at the moment to make them better. So the thing that's interesting about that is there's a kind of radical humiliation and humility that goes along with that. So you say, I have a problem,
Yeah.
and what I know at the moment isn't sufficient to solve it. Great,
Yes.
because now you've opened yourself up to the possibility of learning something. Because
Yes.
you say, well, I don't know enough to fix this. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, you could learn. And one of the things that's so interesting about people is that if they decide they have a problem and they also notice that they could learn, the probability that they will learn goes way up.
That's very interesting. You've actually conflated the first three steps there in your analysis of the first one, because the first one is admission that there's a problem. The second one is recognizing that things could improve, like coming to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And the third one is made a decision to turn our life and our will over to the care of God as we understood God. So, like, yeah.
Yeah,
admit
and we
there's-
could talk about that from a secular
Go on.
perspective. Well, we could talk about that from a secular perspective and say, well, there's a higher order moral principle that needs to be brought into the situation. And you sort of described that right at the beginning of the question, because you said, well, partly what you do when you move from an addicted state, from a psychological perspective, is move from a viewpoint of the gratification of immediate desire and maybe the accumulation of things as a marker of success, to the notion that no, you actually have a higher purpose, and that higher purpose might involve being of service. That could be of service to yourself, which means you wouldn't be addicted anymore, because that's not a good way of being of service to yourself, but of service to yourself and the broader community, however you might define that. That's a higher order purpose, and it can integrate your motivations at a level that doesn't leave you at the whim of impulse. That's the
Yes.
purpose of a higher order motivation. So, okay, so we've got three.
Yes, that's the first three, is to get you to that position where you're willing to change, believe in the possibility of change, and accept help in order to achieve that change.
Yep.
The fourth and fifth steps are about inventorying. This is where the 12-step program becomes a fusion of spirituality and psychoanalysis, because the fourth step is like a 4-column method where you write down a list of all your resentments in your life, your childhood resentments, your resentments against the government, people you work with. You write it all down, and then there's a diagnostic tool where you identify what it is in you that doesn't like that. And also, interestingly, in 12-step theology, let's call it, it says that anytime that you are personally disturbed, you have to take responsibility for it to a degree. There is something in you that's being affected.
Yeah, you should at least ask yourself that question.
Yes.
Like, is it me or is it the world?
Yes.
It's like, well, let's consider first the possibility that it might be you. I wrote about that in the 6th rule, right? Put your house
Set
in
your
perfect
own
order.
house. Yes, yes. In fact, I've got our 2 rule. I did a truncated and somewhat more linguistically explicit, an expletive-laden version of the 12 steps, and I've got your 12 rules for life here, and they don't necessarily correlate. But because say your first one, stand up straight with your shoulders back. That's a great chapter, I think, and I love the lobster stuff and the sort of the ancient, timeless, almost roots of hierarchies and the chemicals that are at play. What's happening when what's at play when we talk about self-esteem. The 6th one, set your own house in perfect order. I said before you criticize the world. Steps 4 and 5 in a 12-step program deal with that. Inventory what's going on in your life.
Right.
Inventory what your baggage is and your own personal
Well,
narrative.
you think it's very practical, Dad. It's like, well, let's say you want to fix up your house, which is actually quite a lot like fixing yourself up, which is a very common dream metaphor.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing you want to do is go look around and see what needs to be fixed. And the interesting thing about that, and this is akin to what comedians do, is that as soon as you're willing to admit, comedians look at a problem and then rise above it right away and make a joke about it, but as soon as you're willing to admit that you have a problem, then you've immediately contacted the part of yourself that's at least strong enough to admit that you have a problem. And so the act of admitting the problem is actually the first step to solving it.
Yes.
You might say, well, and it's an optimistic step, because you might say, oh my God, I can't admit that I have a problem, because what if I can't solve it? Well, exactly. So then maybe you won't admit to it. If you do admit to it, you're simultaneously admitting to the possibility that you could solve it.
Yes.
And then it can actually become something that's optimistic. You can say,
Yes.
well, my life is horrible. It's like, okay, but I'm doing 50 things wrong. Well, great, I could fix those things, and then maybe it wouldn't be so horrible.
The admission itself demonstrates progression and possibility for further progression.
Exactly.
I think it relates
That's
to
why humility is always stressed in great religious traditions. Humility is precisely that. It's like you have to look at why you're not so good. You
Yeah.
have to, and you know, that has to break down your pride to some degree and your arrogance. It's like, well, that's great, because if you break down your pride and your arrogance, then you're primed to learn and you can solve your problems. So there's nothing in that. It's a bit crushing to begin with, because you might think, oh my God, there's really a lot of things wrong with me.
Yes.
But at least then you're on the road to fixing them.
My personal journey of recovery has been like a kind of death. Like, you know, like when I was 27, it was like the death of the drug addict self. That guy died.
That's funny, because I told Tammy when we were coming here today that when you were 27, you made the decision to live.
Yes.
I knew it was 27 because that's when people, I'm going to
Die.
say like you, but you know,
Yeah.
celebrities who are sort of on fire, they die all the time at 27 because they don't make that decision. They don't decide that they're going to take that final step into maturation. They want to hold on to that Peter Pan thing, that possibility.
eternus.
You bet. Exactly that. They want to hold on to that. And you can't hold on to that and live.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then there's a further death I'm noticing now in my early 40s, that like, now at the midway point,
Yeah.
at the midway, in a sort of Dante-esque way, and now I'm moving towards the grave. And now I'm like, there's a different kind of alertness emerging. And back to this step 4 and 5 moment, this process of inventorying. After you've made an inventory and you've honestly and openly put down everything, incidents of child abuse, things that you've said to other people, things that your shame, once you've been willing to inscribe your shame, then you tell another person, a person that you trust. In the original literature, it says, you know, it could be a cleric, a doctor, or whatever. Typically in 12-step structures, it's like a mentor figure, but that's the role of confession, which is obviously a huge part of psychoanalysis. The point in your book, I think this pertains to, is when you talk about the dragon, and like the dragon you said there was that kid's book that you read where it talks about the dragon getting bigger and bigger if it's not identified. I think 4 and 5 are somewhat like that.
Yeah, well, and part of the point of that kid's book is that as soon as you turn around and look at something, it tends to shrink. And that's partly because imagine that you have a memory that you won't confront. Well, there's something in that memory that's terrifying. And that means it's sort of associated with everything else that's terrifying. And so it's horrible. But then when you turn around and look at it, you think, yeah, it's horrible, but it's horrible in this precise and defined way. And that takes it away from all the other potential horrors of it. It starts to shrink it right away. It also makes you into the thing that can turn around and look at the horror, which is a real positive transformational act on your part. So
it's true that somehow in being prescriptive and being specific, the problem becomes manageable, because otherwise it's limitless. It's potential. It becomes apocalyptic in the end. What's the worst thing that's happened is I could be destroyed, and everyone I love could be destroyed, and Earth itself could be destroyed. And until you say, well, actually, no, what this is you feel inadequate because you weren't role modeled correctly.
Right.
So there's, right, well, I can maybe take care of that.
Right, that's still bad, but it's not everything. And then you phrased that exactly right, is that without that attentive delimiting, it becomes apocalyptic. That's a very, very old idea. So one of the things that happens in the Mesopotamian creation myth, the Anu Elish, is that the gods are created, they're the offspring of chaos. That's a good way of thinking about it. And they become very careless, and they destroy their category system. They destroy their father, essentially, and chaos comes flooding back. And that's what happens to people who aren't looking at things and delimiting them properly. They become apocalyptic and do them in.
Thank you for that, Kate. Yeah, and there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. You know, the steps. That's the overview of the steps. You know, it says here we took the steps. These are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. You know, I myself am in recovery, and these are the steps that I've had to take as well. And it gets better. You know, life really is enjoyable and loving.